writing good applications. And I'll again focus on the Public Scholars Program with those tips. All right, so what is NEH? How are we organized? NEH is a taxpayer-funded federal agency. We were founded in 1965, and we're dedicated to supporting research, education, preservation, and public programs in all areas of the humanities, and also in those areas of the social sciences that employ humanistic methods. We award grants through national competitions. Those competitions are based on peer review. So we recruit outside experts to advise us on the merits of the applications that we receive. And we make our awards based on the ratings and comments that we get from those outside experts. The demand for our grants, unfortunately, is much greater than our capacity to make them. So all of our programs are quite competitive. The overall funding ratio across the endowment is about 17%. And it's actually lower than that in our programs for individuals. And I have some more statistics on that a little bit later in the presentation. Our goals in running these competitions appear on this slide. They're to support state and local programs in the humanities, to strengthen teaching and learning in schools and colleges, to preserve and provide access to cultural and educational resources, to strengthen humanities institutions, to provide opportunities for public engagement and lifelong learning, to support experimentation with digital technologies in the humanities, and then also to facilitate research and original scholarship. Each of those goals corresponds roughly to one of our 7 different divisions and offices, which are listed on this slide. Each of these divisions and offices has its own slate of grant programs. Combined, the total budget that we have at NEH for grant making is in the neighborhood of $125 million a year. I think it's good for you to have an awareness of how we're organized, because it's possible your ideas might fit into more than one place in the endowment. And understanding our structure can also help you find the right person to talk to about your ideas. But today, because time's limited, I'm just going to focus on the Division of Research Programs, the last one listed on this slide. The Division of Research Programs supports scholars, individuals, and collaborative teams working on research projects that advance knowledge and understanding of the humanities. Our nickname is the Division of Books because so many of the people who get grants from us are writing books, but we support a wide variety of products, both print and digital products. And if you look on the left side of this slide, you can see the things that we fund include articles, monographs, multi-authored volumes, archaeological reports, translations, editions, and other interpretive tools. And the grants that we give can be used for travel, including travel to archives, research, fieldwork, writing, scholarly editing, collaboration, or convening, which means putting on a conference. This slide has a selective list of our grant programs in the Division of Research Programs. And you can see that we divide them into 2 families. We have grants for institutional applicants meant to support teams of scholars. And we also have grants for individual applicants, including several different flavors of fellowships, the Summer Stipends Program, and then also the Public Scholars Program. And again, because time is short, I'm just going to talk about the programs that are highlighted in yellow on this slide. I want to start off by mentioning a new program to give it a plug, and that's the Archaeological and Ethnographic Field Research Program. This is an institutional grant supporting field work in the humanities. And that could be either archaeological field work or ethnographic field work. These grants are for 4 to 36 months of work. They go up to $150,000. There is somewhat unusually a $20,000 matching requirement in the event that the project director is a tenured faculty member. And you should also be aware that these grants are meant strictly for field research, so they don't support time spent working on writing, they don't support publication. So if you're working on a project that is at the writing or publication phase, you should apply to a different program in our division, such as the collaborative research program. The next deadline in this program is going to be in September 2021. We just had a deadline, so you'll have to wait a year to apply for this program. I'm going to shift gears now to talk about grants for individuals, starting with the fellowships program. This program is the single oldest program at the endowment. It's the one in which we see the highest volume of applications as well. These grants typically support research or writing leading to scholarly publication. And the awards must be held for 6 to 12 months of continuous full-time work. So if you're at a college or university and you have teaching responsibilities, it's likely you would need to arrange leave in order to hold a fellowship from NEH. The stipend is $5,000 per month, and that brings me to another important point about the fellowships program, and in fact all of our programs for individuals, which is that the award is based on the number of months that you commit to working on your project. So there is no budget form required as part of these applications. The eligibility in the fellowships program, and again in all of our individual grant programs, is limited to US citizens and to non-citizens who've resided in the US for the 3 years preceding the application deadline. The next deadline in the fellowships program is April 14th, 2021. And that would be for projects starting sometime the following year, sometime in 2022, or by September 1st of 2023. So we give you a pretty generous window in which to start your clock ticking on your grant period. And that's true again, in all of our individual fellowships programs or individual grant programs. Next, I want to talk about the NEH Mellon Fellowships for Digital Publication. This is a program that we run in partnership with the Mellon Foundation. These grants support projects that can only be published in digital format, either because they offer the reader flexible pathways through the material to be published, or because they incorporate audio or video clips or other forms of multimedia presentation. Otherwise, the dollar amounts and the award periods are the same as those for regular NEH fellowships. Although, as you can see, the deadline is slightly later. The next deadline in this program is going to be April 28th, 2021. Okay, that brings us then to the Public Scholars Program. This program is relatively new. It was launched in 2015, and it supports well-researched nonfiction books in the humanities that are intended to reach a broad audience of general readers. One of the goals of this program is to encourage academic writers to think about the size of the audience that they reach and to think about how to increase the size of that audience. It takes, we know, a great deal of time and thought to write effectively for a general readership. If you're a professional scholar, it's probably actually easier to write for other scholars than it is to write for the general reader. That's probably what you were trained to do. So writing for a general audience requires some adjustment. We want, with this program, to encourage you to make that adjustment. As with the other fellowships I mentioned, the maximum award is $60,000, which would be for 12 months of full-time work. But unlike the other fellowships, this program allows for part-time work during the award period. You still have to commit to the equivalent of 6 full-time months of work as a minimum, but it could be on a part-time basis. Or you could combine part-time work with full-time work. That's also allowed. The next deadline is December 16th, 2020, and that will be for projects starting as early as September 1st of next year. To be eligible for this program, in addition to that citizenship or residency requirement that I mentioned previously, there's also a requirement for previous publication. And that requirement is that you either have to have previously published a nonfiction book with a commercial or university press, or you have to have published at least 3 articles or essays appearing in general interest publications that have a large national or international audience. The book pictured on this slide is Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, The Story of Little Women and Why It Still Matters by Anne Boyd Rue, and it was published last year by W.W. Norton. Like this book on the slide, most of the projects that we've funded so far in the Public Scholars Program are for topics that are connected with the United States in some way. But there's no requirement that your topic have a US focus. And so I want to disabuse you of potential misconceptions in that area. We have funded a number of projects that don't have a US focus, and they're entirely welcome. Here are 3 projects that focus on other areas of the world, and all of these were funded just in the last round. The first is a study of popular religious practice among Jews, Christians, and pagans in late antiquity. The second is a history of efforts to destroy and also preserve the medieval ghost town of Ani on the Turkish-Armenian border. And the third is a study of how dissidents in China work to document events suppressed in China's official national history. The next slide gives you statistics on numbers of applications and success rates in these programs. You can see the competition is stiff. We tend to fund about 7 to 10% of the applications that we get in fellowships, NEH Mellon fellowships, and in the Public Scholars Program. So these numbers are daunting, I realize, but I always tell people that your chances automatically go to 0% if you don't submit an application at all. And we do allow you, by the way, to submit concurrent applications to the Public Scholars Program and to one of our other fellowships programs. So that could improve your odds somewhat. Moving on now to the submission process and the review process and tips. One of the first things that you will need to do if you decide you're interested in a particular NEH program is to locate what we call the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Whoops. Yeah, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFO, or the NOFO, we sometimes call it as well. The Notice of Funding Opportunity describes the program and its purpose in detail. It gives you the instructions for applying. It tells you whether you can submit a draft for staff comment. It lists the prohibited project types and activities in section D6, always. And it spells out the review criteria for that particular program as well. So as an applicant, you'll definitely need to become well acquainted with the Notice of Funding Opportunity for any NEH program that you're targeting. You can always find the Notice of Funding Opportunity on the resource page for that program. And this slide shows the upper portion of the resource page for the Public Scholars Program. And probably the easiest way to get to this is just to enter NEH Public Scholars into your favorite search engine. You can find it through our front door at NEH.gov as well. But at any rate, once you've gotten here, you'll find all sorts of useful resources. If you scroll down to the lower portion of the page, this is where you'll find the Notice of Funding Opportunity indicated by the red arrow on this slide. You'll also find a list of previous awards, samples of winning applications, and an FAQ document for the program. Once you open up the NOFO, you'll find included in the instructions an explanation of the materials that you need to submit for your application and the associated page limits. In the Public Scholars Program, we ask for a 3-page narrative statement, a bibliography, a work plan, a CV, a writing sample, supporting letters, and then there's some additional online forms as well. If you've applied in the past for the Public Scholars Program, you should take note that we have shortened the length of the narrative statement. It's 3 pages for the next round, but we're giving you 1 page that's designated specifically for the plan of work as partial compensation for that newer, stricter limitation. And all of these page limits, by the way, are strict. You must follow them, or you risk being disqualified from the competition. Once you have prepared your materials, you'll have to submit the application through the grants.gov website. And this is the central clearinghouse for nearly all federal grant applications, and every NEH application has to be submitted through this separate website at grants.gov. If you're applying for an individual grant, such as a fellowship or a Public Scholars Award, you'll need to create an account on this website for yourself. And if you're doing an institutional grant, probably someone in your grants office will set that up for you and handle the submission. But for individual grant programs, you should set up your own account at grants.gov and use that to submit your application. So that's something you'll need to do well ahead of the deadline. Next, application review. How do we review your application? We sort the applications into clusters based on the topic, and we assign each of those clusters to a panel of outside peer reviewers who give us ratings and comments on each application that they read. In the Public Scholars Program, we use 4-person review panels, and they include scholars, non-academics who've written popular books in the area of the panel, Also people who've worked as editors at major presses. The next step is staff recommendation. We on the staff make funding recommendations to a body called the National Council on the Humanities, which serves as a board of directors for our agency. The National Council meets 3 times a year to review the staff's recommendations and also to weigh in with its own advice. And that advice then goes to the chairman of the endowment, and it's the chairman who has sole legal authority to make an NEH grant. So this is a multi-step process in which many different people read your application, and that's why it takes us about 7 or 8 months in most programs to review your application and give you an answer about whether you'll receive funding or not. Next, tips. The single most important tip I can give you is to be familiar with the published evaluation criteria for the program that you're applying to, and to write your application to address those criteria. Here are the criteria for the Public Scholars Program, and I'll just read through them here. The first is the appeal and intellectual significance of the proposed book for general readers. Both appeal and significance are important. The project should be engaging, highly engaging, but it should also have substance. Second, the applicant's record of research and experience in interpreting the humanities for general audiences. You want to be sure to highlight your record in these areas on your resume and in your application narrative, and you want to coach your letter writers to do the same. Third, the quality of the conception, definition, organization, and description of the project, and the breadth and depth of the humanities research underlying the project. So the project should be well-defined, well-organized, and you should show that you're aware of the relevant existing work in your area as well. Fourth, the quality of the writing sample and the applicant's clarity of expression. The writing sample is very important, central in fact in these applications, because that's where you're demonstrating that you can write for a popular audience. Fifth, the feasibility and appropriateness of the proposed plan of work, the soundness and probable reach of the dissemination plan, and the likelihood that the applicant will complete the project. You need to clearly explain your work plan and your publication plan. A word here about COVID. We don't expect you to take the COVID pandemic into account in your work plan because things are just too unpredictable. So you don't have to do that, and it's possible that we can adjust your work plan at a later stage if necessary in the event that you win an award. Some particular tips for public scholars applicants. First of all, frame the project effectively. Emphasize intrinsic interest rather than academic points of reference. Often applicants who come from an academic background are used to justifying projects on the basis of an intervention in an academic debate of some kind, or on the basis of a promise to fill a gap in knowledge. For this program, you're probably going to need to adjust your strategy to focus, as I say here, on intrinsic interest. Let's go back for a moment to a project I mentioned earlier as one of those non-US focused projects. This is Michael Satlow's project on popular religious practice. Here's an excerpt from his application where he's explaining the essence of the book, and I've underlined the most important part. He says, this book will bring to life the spiritual landscape of late antiquity shared by Jews, Christians, and pagans alike. While the elites of these emerging traditions were fighting about boundaries and excoriating those who dared to cross them, most people in the Eastern Mediterranean between the 3rd and 7th centuries largely lived in the same conceptual world. This was a world or landscape with shared assumptions about the role that divine beings played in their lives and the practices and techniques that could be used to get these beings to help, even if these practices often had distinctive superficial markings of religious or ethnic identity. That's an idea that is intrinsically interesting. And he's putting it front and center in his description of what the project's about. There are almost certainly scholarly debates behind this claim, but he is keeping them in the background to focus on the big picture here. That's not to say that you should ignore controversy or that you should provide a simplistic analysis in your project, but you should think carefully about how you're focusing the reader's attention and what you are putting front and center, how you're keeping clear what is at stake in your discussion. Here are some other examples of books that we've funded in the program. Each one has an identifiable strategy for focusing the reader's attention and telling a story. On the left, Abram Van Engen's book, City on a Hill, focuses on the history of the phrase city on a hill in American writings and speeches as it traces the history of American exceptionalism. Kimberly Hamlin's book on the women's suffrage movement is focused on the life of one key player in that movement, Helen Hamilton Gardner. And on the right, Caleb McDaniel's book, Sweet Taste of Liberty, which just won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way, is focused on a legal case in which a slave successfully sued her former master. So think about whether you too could use some kind of clear device to focus and tell your story as you're putting together a public scholars application. Next tip, submit a writing sample pitched for a general audience from the proposed book if possible. As I said, the writing sample is absolutely central to public scholars applications. If possible, submit a sample from the proposed project. That makes the project that much more tangible for the reviewers. They start to feel as if they're holding it in their hands as they're reviewing. And it also gives you another 20 pages in which to elaborate on your project and sell it to the reviewers. Whatever you submit as a sample, it should demonstrate the style of the proposed book. It should show your ability to write for a general audience. Many proposals are rejected in this competition on the basis of the writing sample because it fails to convince the reviewers that the applicant actually understands what will appeal to the general reader. Present a clear and realistic work plan. You don't want to be vague when it comes to your work plan. Provide a clear timeline, explain what you need to accomplish, how long each task is going to take, and how far you will have advanced the project by the end of the grant period. Develop a strong dissemination plan. This program's designed to support books that will get attention. That includes media attention. It includes a broad readership. So you want to make a strong case when it comes to your dissemination plan. A good chunk of our awards go to people who have a contract with a trade press and a letter of support from that press at the time of application. And many of those letters of support are able to promise a print run in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 10,000 or more copies. We also fund many applications under contract with university presses. Those tend to be with presses that have very strong distribution, such as Oxford University Press, Yale, Chicago, Harvard, Princeton. And again, many of these applicants have a letter from the publisher mentioning a print run of 5,000 to 10,000 copies or more as a projection. And we funded smaller print runs. We don't have hard and fast rules about minimum print runs, but much of your competition, if you apply, will be able to point to potential print runs of that size. We also fund applicants who don't have a contract at the time of application. Those people, though, usually either have a strong record already with writing books for popular audiences, or they have a letter from a good press, or that is expressing interest in a contract, or they have both. This next slide shows just sort of boils down what I've just said about types of dissemination plans we see. About 30% of the successful applicants to the program are under contract with a trade press when they apply. About 20% under contract with a university press. About 50% don't yet have a contract when they apply. But again, many people who were successful in this competition and did not have a contract when they applied did have a letter of interest from a good publisher or a strong record of writing books for a popular audience. Last tip on this slide, manage your letter writers. We ask you to submit 2 letters of recommendation, and the best letters show a high level of engagement with the proposed project. You should show your letter writers your application before you submit it. You should coach them to write a paragraph in the letter that addresses the appeal for general readers and the intellectual significance for general readers of your project. And ideally, all the rest of the evaluation criteria as well. You want to check to make sure your letters have come in. You can do that on our website. You should certainly follow up with your letter writers if there seems to be a problem. This is my last slide. It has tips for all NEH applicants. The first one, study the sample applications. I mentioned they're on the resource page for each program. Be aware of prohibited project types. I've mentioned this also, always in section D6 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. In the Public Scholars Program, for example, we disallow dissertation revisions, autobiographies, memoirs, guidebooks, how-to books, books that promote specific public policies are also disallowed. And there's quite a list of others as well, other things that we disallow. So you want to be sure to check that you're not falling afoul of our list of prohibited project types. Watch the online information session. In many programs, we conduct an online information session for applicants, and we leave a recording available on the NEH website. The information session for the Public Scholars Program will be on Monday, November 9th, and you can register on the resource page for the program. Submit a draft application. I think I mentioned the Notice of Funding Opportunity will always state whether you are allowed to submit a draft application or not. In the Public Scholars Program, we do not allow draft applications, but you should definitely take advantage of that service if it's allowed in the particular program that you're interested in. Consult with a program officer. It's not required. Many people get a grant without ever checking in with us, but as I said at the outset, you shouldn't hesitate to consult with us if you have questions. Reapply. If you're rejected the first time you apply, try again. Unless you mention it in your application, the reviewers will be none the wiser that you are reapplying. We have 100% turnover on our review panels from year to year. Last one, ask for your comments. This is one of the great services of NEH. We can't give everyone money, but we can give everyone feedback. So when you get your notification of the competition results, you should just hit reply right away on that email and ask for your reviewers' comments. You should do that, by the way, even if you have been offered an award, because there might well be something useful in those comments to you. because of the feedback that we provide, a panelist once called NEH the biggest and best humanities consulting firm on earth. And we're quite proud of that reputation, and I hope you'll take advantage of what we have to offer. All right, that's the end of the presentation that I prepared. And as I promised, I'm putting my contact information up on the screen now, and let's open up to questions.
Thank you, Mark, so much. And there was already a question on the chat, which I'm not sure if it's something that's already addressing the FAQs, but what kinds of publications would be considered acceptable for articles as previous publication for the Public Scholars Program?
So for the Public Scholars Program, what kind of articles would be considered acceptable? The guidelines, the Notice of Funding Opportunity says that they must have appeared in general interest publications that reach a large national or international audience. It also says that they need not be print publications, so they could be electronic publications. Generally, what we have in mind are publications of the sort that would be on sale at the typical airport newsstand, for example. So things that are widely read and that are read not only by people who have a professional interest in the material. We don't accept peer-reviewed articles appearing in academic journals as meeting that requirement. If you're uncertain whether the articles or essays that you have published do meet the requirement, feel free to write to us about that. You can send me your CV and we'll take a look at it and give you an answer, yay or nay. So you have a definite answer about whether you're eligible or not. And we do realize that there could be questions about whether particular publications meet that requirement or not.
Thank you. I have a question from Mark Letney.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. This is extremely helpful. I have a quick question. I have actually two quick questions. One is about the Mellon grants. And the question is, if I have, which I do, a print book that has a sort of expanded digital component, could a Mellon grant be used to support the digital component of that? This is a book that will be sort of have a small section of material printed and then a much larger selection with 3D models and all sorts of fun stuff online. And then the other question has to do with the Public Scholars Program and the requirement to have a book. Does the book have to be out, or is a book under contract sufficient to allow someone to apply?
I'll take the second question first, and the answer is yes, the book would have to be out. So the Notice of Funding Opportunity does say that you can't meet that requirement with a book that's not yet published. So you may be in the position of having to wait until the subsequent deadline in order to apply if you're counting on pointing to a not yet published book as your qualification for the competition. Your other question was about the Mellon digital fellowships and whether you could use one of those grants to publish supplementary materials or ancillary materials for a print book. I'm not sure off the top of my head about that. It sounds iffy to me. You should take a look at the Notice of Funding Opportunity to see, and I would start off by looking in section D6, the prohibited project types, and you may also get an answer in the general program description, the first couple of pages. I don't think you should have to read through 20 pages of that document to get an answer. And if you don't see it immediately in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or it seems ambiguous to you, by all means, get in touch with us and we can speak to that. But my guess is that this you're going to run into some language that specifies that it's not for ancillary materials, that it's for the main piece of the project. But again, I'm not 100% sure without checking on that one. Other questions?
Thanks.
There was a question on the chat about whether applicants to public scholars need to be faculty members or they can be independent scholars.
You can certainly be an independent scholar and apply to the Public Scholars Program. There's no requirement that you have an institutional affiliation at all. And we do see applications from, and we fund applications from independent scholars, journalists, other kinds of independent writers, and they're all more than welcome in that program.
Other questions for Mark? I am sure people have questions. The NEH is very large and very competitive. So anything that can help you prepare your application. Mark, I don't know if you can see there's a question on the chat about additional grants for emerging scholars, for scholars who don't yet qualify, but who are interested in this kind of writing.
So I take the implication to be not yet qualified for the Public Scholars Program, but interested. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So a couple of things. First of all, look at the fellowships program and the summer stipends program. Neither of those has any requirement regarding previous publication at all. And it's also quite common that we fund dissertation revisions in those programs. Now, the one caveat is that those both have a more scholarly emphasis than the Public Scholars Program does. You are welcome to submit projects that you intend to reach a broad public audience with to those programs, and the evaluation criteria actually mention that possibility so that you're not at a disadvantage if you're not writing a scholarly or a primarily scholarly work in those programs. But they do have a more scholarly emphasis than the Public Scholars Program. So let's say you really have your heart set on developing yourself as a public scholar, but you don't yet meet the requirements for the Public Scholars Program. What I'd suggest that you do is start developing your portfolio. And you can do that by taking public speaking engagements. You can start trying to publish perhaps op-eds in newspapers or short pieces on widely read websites, maybe slate.com or Huffington Post, something like that. Those would qualify as long as there's an editorial process and an acceptance process for your writing in those publications. And I look at people's CVs in this program, and I can see in many cases a sort of deliberate, stepwise progression from early public speaking engagements to pieces of writing that are starting to garner more and more of an audience, and then finally pieces that are appearing in major national publications to get across the threshold in the Public Scholars Program. So we certainly want to encourage people to emerge in that way, and perhaps the enticement of the Public Scholars Program at the end of that process will help you along.
Thank you, that's very useful. Any more questions? You answered everything in your presentation clearly.
Well, I do hope that it was useful. And if there aren't more questions right now, I'll simply reiterate what I said about not hesitating to be in touch with us if questions do arise. We are happy to do whatever we can to make our programs clearer, and as I said, to help you put your best foot forward.
Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate your time and your very helpful tips. Thank you. I think we will then close. And thank you again for sharing this information with us. And thank you everyone for your questions.
You're more than welcome, and let me add my thanks to the audience for taking some time out of your day to learn about the NEH. Goodbye.
Thanks so
Bye,
much.
thank you.
Bye.